Hi everyone, this is Michael Judge coming to you from Winnipeg in Canada, and as you might be able to tell, I'm using artificial light at the moment because it gets dark very early in Winnipeg this time of the year. On the other hand, we do have a beautiful coating of snow outside. So today I wanted to talk to you about a really fascinating paper that I recently read. The title of the paper is Metals from Spacecraft Reentry in Stratospheric Aerosol Particles. Now, this might seem like a rather unusual topic for an analysis of a scientific paper, but I found this topic very interesting for a number of reasons, and I'd like to tell you about what I learned from looking through this paper. It turns out that in Earth's stratosphere, there are a vast number of nanometer-sized particles which comprise an aerosol made up of sulfuric acid. Many of these particles contain metals in addition to the sulfuric acid as a result of the ablation of meteors that enter the Earth's atmosphere and burn up. So there are already metallic elements such as aluminum in these stratospheric sulfuric acid aerosols. However, there are numerous man-made satellites that are going into space all the time. I understood, of course, as I'm sure you all do, that there are many satellites currently in low Earth orbit. I was surprised to learn, however, that there are currently many thousands of these satellites and many more planned for the future. The authors of this paper mention that as many as 50,000 new satellites may be put into low Earth orbit by 2030. That's an incredible number of devices orbiting around the Earth. Many of these satellites eventually reach the end of their life cycle, or for other reasons will re-enter the atmosphere, where about 90% of the material comprising the device will burn up upon re-entry. In addition to satellites, things like upper stage motors also fall into the atmosphere. When these burn up, they of course release the various materials that they're made out of. And the authors were interested in looking at whether or not these metals that are released enter these stratospheric aerosol particles the same way that metals from meteors do. To analyze this scenario, they performed a really astonishing experiment where they put a time-of-flight mass spectrometer mounted on an aircraft that is used by NASA for atmospheric research. It turns out that some of the stratospheric air is pulled down closer to Earth's surface near the poles. So this aircraft departed from Fairbanks, Alaska, and it went up about 19 kilometers where it was able to sample some of these aerosol particles that had been drawn down from the stratosphere. The way that this works is really fascinating. As the aircraft flies through the atmosphere, it draws in air, and the device in front of the mass spectrometer uses interferometry to determine that particles have entered, and upon recognizing a particle, it uses an ultraviolet laser to essentially vaporize that aerosol particle, and then uses the time-of-flight mass spectrometer to analyze for about 20 different elements, primarily metals, that are contained or may be contained in the particles. Using this technique, they were able to analyze about 500,000 particles with a very high level of sensitivity and came up with some really interesting results. What they found was that indeed many of these aerosol particles that they sampled contained metals that they concluded must have come from spacecraft that had re-entered Earth. This conclusion was based on things like the ratios of various metals, as well as the presence of various more rare or exotic metals like hafnium or niobium that would not be expected to appear in the stratosphere. On this basis, they came to the conclusion that human activity is greatly increasing the metal content of these aerosol particles. The authors weren't able to conclusively state what the repercussions might be of this, but they thought that it might change things like the nucleation of particles, radiative forcing in the stratosphere, and it also might act to conduct large quantities of metals such as copper into regions at the poles which don't normally have a high metal loading. All in all, this was a really interesting paper on an unusual but important topic, and I highly recommend it to anyone who wants to go and read it. Thanks very much. Bye for now.